Hello, welcome back. We have gotten through medical conditions and we have been talking about how babies communicate with us. So now we are moving into looking at infant sucking behaviors and patterns that we can use during our assessment. And we are going to be using an approach called the BROSS approach. And it's something actually that I created with a good friend of mine, Dr. Joy Brown. So these are the learner outcomes for this talk. List the first step in the BROSS approach, and I'm going to really highlight that one for you. Define the defining characteristic of the obligatory step, and summarize the differences between coordinated and integrated steps. So the BROSS approach stands for Baby Regulated Organization of Subsystems and Sucking, which is why we just say BROSS. What we did is we used the synaptic organization of behavioral development as a paradigm for eating in general. And we said, okay, babies don't just start off eating, they need to start off with organization. And so that's where we brought in the synaptic organization theory. We know that feeding begins with internal regulation, and after we have internal regulation, then we can identify sucking patterns that help us with development of feeding skills. Okay? So when we talk about sucking patterns, we're going to talk about burst and pause rhythms. So a burst is when an infant is actively sucking, and a pause are normal breaks in a sucking burst where the baby stops sucking and just is breathing. Okay? So during the burst phase, when they are actively sucking, infants may or may not be breathing and taking catch breaths. Okay? That is the key for understanding where the baby is in development. Breathing is really crucial to understanding where they are in learning about eating, and helps us to identify in part some of the interventions that we might want to use. Okay? So when we think about sucking bursts and breathing pauses, we again come back to this idea of homeostasis, because you need to breathe to be able to maintain your internal regulation. Okay? So when we are looking at sucking bursts and breathing pauses, we need to think about how long can you go without taking breaths, and how you're going to change over time. We also know that eating is reliant on you having the energy to eat. So we have 3 steps before eating in our feeding paradigm. Can you maintain your internal regulation during just routine cares, when people are changing your diaper, taking your temperature? This includes in bed or during skin-to-skin holding. Can you maintain that internal regulation when you're out in a louder environment, or when you start to integrate oral skills, starting with non-nutritive sucking? So this is the little stair step up from base, where it is about starting the organization of your internal core, all the way up to eating, integrating social interaction. So the first 3 steps are not oral feeding steps yet. They are 3 steps for internal regulation. So the very first step in BROSS is stability in bed with handling. Okay, that is your very first step. Now, we just talked about how do you assess stability in bed, or stability with holding, or stability with non-nutritive sucking, because we just talked about the synaptic organization of behavioral development and how babies communicate with us. So we're going to start this talk with the first feeding step, and that is obligatory. Obligatory is the name of the first feeding step that we have identified in this model. Okay, so it's really important to remember that the first step is stability in bed with handling. Okay, so once you have that general core stability, then you can tolerate this extra challenge of demand. Okay? And we have identified a predictable pattern for each of these steps. So the first step is called obligatory. This is the first feeding step. Okay? Here babies generally are having sucking bursts of more than 5 to 7. Okay? I've seen babies have as many as 13 sucks in a row without ever stopping to take a breath. Okay? Or they stop sucking, but then they stop breathing and they do not start breathing. Okay? So obligatory is where a baby is not breathing on their own during feedings. Okay? Either they're sucking and not breathing, so that might be suck, swallow, suck, swallow, suck, swallow, suck, swallow, suck, swallow. You can't do that for very long without starting to desaturate and to slow your heart rate. Okay? If you're not breathing, that is going to lead to a loss of stability. So in general, babies can do 3 up to about 5 suck swallows without breathing, but maintain their core stability as long as they then start breathing. Okay? So here they're either not breathing and all they're doing is sucking and swallowing, or they stop sucking, but they don't start breathing. They just forget how to do that. So the key for obligatory is you have to do something. Okay? The person feeding the baby has to get them to stop and breathe. The key is not just getting them to stop sucking, the key is actually to get them to start breathing. Okay? That is the key characteristic for obligatory, and that is one of your learner outcomes. Okay? So this is sort of what it looks like. And one of your handouts that you have in your dashboard is a handout where all of the steps are listed for you with the little picture representation. So here what you see, the top blue wavy lines are when the baby is sucking, so that's the sucking burst. The breathing is the bottom line, and in this case you see breathing is not happening. So that is the key characteristic for obligatory. Baby starts sucking and has many, many, many sucks and never stops to breathe, which is what you see on the left-hand side. Or baby does start sucking and baby stops sucking, but they don't start breathing. So either way, they're losing stability and you have to do something to fix it. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a little video, and I want you to just watch. This mother is feeding this baby. And when she starts feeding him, he starts off kind of, okay, I can do this. And then he has a wince and kind of a hard swallow, and then he stops sucking. But he also stops breathing. And mom recognizes that he stops sucking and she tilts the bottle, but she does not recognize that he doesn't start breathing, so she doesn't do anything else. She just kind of holds and he deteriorates. She finally responds when the alarm goes off, okay? But that's way too late, okay? So as you start watching this video, I want you to just notice. So there he has this little wince. And he has stopped doing anything. Even when she takes the bottle out, he's still not breathing. His color is getting worse. She finally starts patting him after the alarm goes off. Okay? So I'm actually going to play that again just so that you can see it right from the very beginning. He actually is fairly okay at the beginning. He's like, oh, okay, here we go. And then he does nothing. So she has to rescue him. And that's the key with obligatory, is if you have to kind of jump in and make it better, they went into obligatory. Okay? Now what's tricky is that there are a lot of reasons why babies might be an obligatory. Maybe he generally does pretty well, but he just got a circumcision, or he got all of his 2-month shots, and he's a little less stable. So none of these steps are really concrete, solid for quite a while. You'll see babies will kind of move up and down these little staircases, okay? So that's an example of obligatory. This is another example of obligatory, and this one's a little trickier. It's a little more subtle. So what you're going to see in the beginning is he's feeding, mom just has the bottle in his mouth, everything seems to be going well. And then he's going to start to kind of show with his face that, oh, this is a little more difficult. And then his arms are going to start to fall apart, further away, I mean, fall apart. And he's going to kind of like struggle almost like he's drowning. And mom finally rescues him, okay? And you might even be able to see him breathing. So here is where he kind of stops. It's as if he's like, wait a minute, what am I supposed to do? He's not breathing, his arms fall away. He then kind of bobs his head up and down, but he's not really passing any of the air. The alarm goes off and mom responds. Okay, so the number one key is, if you have to do something to remind the baby to breathe, they're an obligatory. Now, we don't want to wait till a baby sets off the alarm, okay? Because what's happening is that's an aversive experience. If I stop breathing and then my alarm is saying, ooh, my heart rate's going down, I'm not able to catch my breath, that's an aversive experience. So we have an intervention that is very effective at helping babies if they're doing this. And it's called regulated pacing. And we're going to talk about it tomorrow, okay? In the very next module, we're going to be talking about it, okay? All right, so that is something that you see in babies that are really kind of on the edge of being good enough for eating at that particular time, okay? So the next step that you see is when the baby takes ownership of stopping and breathing. So now we have better oxygenation. Breathing is going to happen outside of sucking bursts, but the baby will start the breathing on their own. So typically sucking is 2 to 5 sucks. So you might get suck, swallow, breathe, and then they'll do it again. Sometimes maybe they do 5 sucks and swallows and then stop and breathe. But the key is they are the ones stopping and breathing. You're not the one who is rescuing them. You're not having to remind them to stop and breathe, okay? So that's the key difference. With obligatory, they don't know how to stop and breathe. They either don't know how to stop, or they know how to stop, but they don't know how to breathe after they stop sucking, okay? Alternating is the next mature step, where they will suck and swallow, suck and swallow, suck and swallow, stop and breathe, suck and swallow, suck and swallow, suck and swallow, stop and breathe. So now the infant is the one that's setting the pattern, and you don't have to pace them anymore, okay? So it sort of looks like this. It's not that rhythmic. Sometimes they have 3 sucks in a burst. Sometimes they may have 5 sucks in a burst, okay? But when they stop sucking, they start breathing. And this is always tricky when you're watching videos. It's a lot easier when you're watching babies, in part because you can get down on your hands and knees if you need to and see the breathing, because watching for breathing can be tricky, all right? But in this video, what you're going to see is the parent is not tilting the bottle. The parent isn't moving any of that. All she's doing is she's holding the bottle. The baby is going to have some sucking bursts that are a little longer, some that are a little shorter. But you hopefully will be able to see sucking, sucking, sucking with his jaw movement, and then it stops and his nose, he often has kind of a big inhale because he goes a little too long on occasion. But he is the one who's stopping and breathing all on his own. When he starts sucking, he stops breathing. So you see it's a little bit of an effort for him. Every once in a while his face gets a little furrowed, like, oh, this is hard, hey? But overall, he's handling this challenge. And you see the parent isn't tilting and stopping and doing any of that stuff. The baby has got that part under control, hey? So he has now taken over that responsibility. When you see a baby being able to manage the breathing for themselves, we want to not use regulated pacing anymore. So this is where we hand over that responsibility to the baby, okay? So, okay, I know I'm supposed to breathe. I don't know how to breathe and keep sucking, so I'm separating them. That's alternating. I alternate between sucking and breathing. So if I need to eventually get to sucking, swallowing, and breathing, what's the middle step? It's called intermittent. Here, they're beginning to integrate breathing when they're in the sucking burst. So every once in a while, they remember to take a little catch breath. Now, because occasionally they take these little catch breaths while they're sucking and swallowing, they're maintaining their oxygenation a little bit better, and now you're going to see longer sucking bursts start to come in. If I'm breathing while I'm sucking, I can have more sucks in a row. And that's going to also be correlated typically with better integration of suction, and babies who are in intermittent are typically now able to start taking in more volume. So if you work with babies only after they go home, most of the time you're not going to see obligatory. Most babies will go home either in alternating, which was the last step, or this step, which is intermittent. Okay? And this is sort of what it looks like. So you see it's a bit chaotic. You've got sucking that has starts and stops, okay? And some of the sucking bursts are longer now than 5 sucks. The breathing happens when the baby stops sucking. So there's the burst of sucking and then breathing during the pause. But you also see occasional breaths in the middle of a sucking burst. Okay? That's the key difference. Now they're trying to figure out, how do I bring this one extra piece in? Okay? So that's what's called intermittent. Now what you will see in this video coming up is that this baby is actually the same baby you just watched. He was in alternating, now he's at home, and he is going to start learning, how do I do this sucking, swallowing, and breathing. And so if you're watching his little nose again, hopefully you're able to see sometimes he just sucks and swallows, and sometimes he sucks and swallows, takes a little catch breath, and keeps going, okay? And sometimes his bursts are longer and sometimes they're short. But he still has a little bit of a furrowed brow because he's still needing to kind of think about this. Okay? And it's arrhythmic. So there's kind of longer pauses as he's trying to figure out, is this how I do this? Okay. What is the next step? Well, the next step is coordinated. This is kind of our gold standard for most people. And that's where babies are coordinating, sucking, swallowing, and breathing. And it's really not effortful at all. They've got this down. You put the bottle near their mouth, they kind of go on autopilot and they're able to just suck and swallow. The bursts start to get really long and breathing is becoming rhythmically integrated. So oftentimes what you'll see is one suck, swallow, breath, one suck, swallow, breath, or you might see two sucks, a swallow, and a breath, two sucks, a swallow, and a breath, two sucks, a swallow, and a breath. So they are figuring out, how do I breathe without kind of interruptions and start and stop the sucking bursts and keep breathing while I'm doing the sucking. So in this video, the biggest thing what you're going to see is just this baby kind of has this down. Okay? It's not a big deal for him. You give it to him and he kind of goes on autopilot. Now, what's hard is he's wiggling around, and so it's much more challenging to see the breathing with him. And actually, you're going to see that's common. When a baby is really well organized, generally they're kind of a little bit older and they wiggle around a little more. So what I want you to think about, though, is not only what is he eating, but how is he engaging, or is he engaging? So I'm going to actually play that again because it's such a short little video clip. Watch where his eyes are going. He's kind of on autopilot. He's not really attending to his mom. He's more kind of looking off into space. And we see that a lot, especially with children with feeding problems. So you see it with babies who are preterm, but you also see it with babies who have feeding problems. They're not really integrating social interaction. So that was important to Joy and I. Dr. Joy Brown and I put this model together. And we really think about feeding as a social interaction between the mother and the baby, between the father and the baby. And so when we started asking that question and looking at the babies that we were following in early intervention or in the clinic setting, we decided to add this extra step in, integrated. So here, eating is so easy that there's no challenge from the feeding itself, and they can integrate social interaction while maintaining full coordination. Okay? And here typically you're seeing a really positive association with the feeding itself. And so when you watch this, even though there's no sound, you'll see the parent and the child, the mom is clearly talking to the baby, and the baby is watching mom and eating, and everything has a very different feel to it.
I did. Here it is. Here it is. There you go. There you go. See, I told you it was coming. Yeah. You're tired. You didn't get me up, did you? Yeah.
So this is a baby that was born at 30 weeks, and she's one of 4. So she's a quadruplet. And what you're seeing is, as she has matured, she is now able to visually interact with her mom and eat. And it's not really a problem. And you saw she was demanding before she got the food as well. And so this, for us, is our last step. The difference between integrated and coordinated is not about how they're sucking. It's about the addition of the social interaction. And what you'll see if you look at research about feeding is that most babies, most preterm babies, when they go home, they're not available for social interaction. In fact, many of them keep their eyes closed for most of the feeding. And the parents are not really asking them to interact because parents have learned, let your baby focus on eating, okay? The key is sometime between 1 and 4 months after they're going home, the baby starts to be able to integrate social interaction, but the moms are rarely talking to their babies. When the parent has learned to let their baby focus on feeding, even when the baby is available for social interaction, sometimes parents are missing it. And so we did a study of 27 babies, and what we found was a correlation. The younger they were, the earlier on the steps to the BROSS, so they were more likely working on the lower steps, and as they got older, they started to move up in these different sucking habits. And that was statistically significant. We also redid it with breastfed infants, and we didn't publish that one. What we found is that breastfed infants typically skipped the obligatory step, but all the other steps we could see. At breast, babies were alternating, intermittent, coordinated, and I have a video of a baby who is integrating social interaction while breastfeeding as well. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. So these are steps that kind of help you to measure progress. And it's one of the things that I do look at when I'm looking at the skill and efficiency steps. Remember, skill, efficiency, endurance, consistency. Skill, one of the things I'm looking at is where are they in learning these different sucking patterns, okay? Most likely the reason why breastfed babies skipped obligatory is because they're more mature, they are more active when they root, and so we know that they're ready for feeding. In fact, in my career, twice in 32 years have I worked with a baby breastfeeding who is in obligatory. Okay, that's very uncommon. So we can still use pacing to help a baby at breast. It's just a lot more complicated. So these are some of the key takeaways for this talk. Infants begin to build supports for oral feeding at birth, and those supports are those internal regulatory abilities. We also know that infants have a predictable course that is developing sucking, swallowing, and breathing patterns. And those patterns actually are similar for breast and bottle-fed infants, although babies show less distress at breastfeeding. And the biggest difference is they don't have the most worrisome and dangerous step, which is obligatory when they're at breast. So what we're able to do is look at progress beginning at birth, and we can start to develop assessment plans, but we also can start to look at treatment programs based on where are they in this process. And you're going to see we have lots of things we can do to support organization of the baby, even if they're not orally feeding yet. Okay? And so knowing where they are in this progression is our first step in learning about where they are in development.